In this tutorial, we're going to work our way through the Create Shape form, where we're going to look at a series of different vectors and how we can alter the settings within this form to create different shapes. So let's go to File, Close. And so let's go and open an existing file. So from our project folder, we've got the Create Shape example. So here we've just got a set of simple vectors that were created in the software, and we're going to use these vectors to demonstrate the Create Shape tool. So let's start by tiling our windows horizontally. That way we've got the 2D view at the top and we have the 3D view at the bottom. And to access the Create Shape tool, we go into the Modeling tab, and it's located within the Modeling tools, and it's the first icon in the list. And if we click on that, that will open up the Create Shape form. So in order to create a shape, we must select a vector that we want to create a shape from. For example, let's select this circle vector here. And then we can use the many options within the form to create a shape based on this circle shape. First off, we have the profile. We have three options: a curved profile, an angular profile, and we have a flat profile. And you can assign any one of these profiles, and that will apply that to the shape of our circle. Once you've assigned that shape, then you have many other options to control the shape. For example, we can assign an angle by typing in a value here, or we could look at using the slide bar to alter the angle. We then have options to control the height, where we can apply a base height. We can also look at applying a final height. And again, many options within this form to control that height. Then you can choose how you want to combine this component with any other components you may have within your job, whereby you can choose to add that. We could look at subtracting it, we could merge the highest points, or we could look at merging the lowest points. And then when you're happy with the settings that you've got, you can simply go in there and give that component a name. So here we could just simply call that one Dome. And then you can press apply to see the result of these settings with this vector. And in the 2D view, you can see I'm presented with this yellow object here. And then in the 3D view, we're presented with the actual shape of our part based on the settings that we've got in our form. And so if you were happy with the shape that you had here, you can simply just close out of the form. And we can see that we have a component here within our component tree. It's got the name that we gave it within that form, and if I select it, it will highlight that in the component tree, as well as highlighting the component grayscale in the 2D view, and it also highlights in the 3D view. And if I wanted to, I could select it again. I could look at size in the component. I can move it around. I can also move it around in the 3D view. And if I wanted to remove this, I can do so by right-clicking on the dome component. We'll use this option here to delete that component. It's removed it from my component tree. I can no longer see a 2D grayscale in the 2D view, and I can no longer see the component in the 3D view. So now let's have a look at some of the other options that we have within the Create Shape form. So if we go back to the Create Shape form, and again, the first thing that we need to do is select a vector. So we're going to assign this circle again this time. So just going to go the same settings, curve profile 45 degrees, and then once you're happy, you can press apply. And again, we can see the component here in the 3D view. We can see the yellow object in the 2D view. And the reason why it's yellow is because we're still in a state where we can make changes to this. Now, if I wanted to accept this, but I wanted to create a new shape, I could use this option here to start a new component. And so you'll see now that everything has been deselected. The component is no longer selected, the vector is no longer selected, because we've accepted those changes, applied them, and then we've requested to start a new component. So the next thing we need to do now is select a new vector. So we could look at this rectangle vector here, And then we could look at working our way through the form to create a shape for this rectangle. For example, we could go with an angled profile this time. Simply go in there and press apply. Again, we can see the result of that in the 3D view. We can see the result of that in the 2D view where we're in a state of yellow. So at the moment we're able to make changes and it will alter that. The moment we hit apply and close or start a new component, if we do that now, you'll see it's deselected everything. We now have a grayscale. We've got the component here in the 3D view, and we can move on to the next object that we want to create a shape for. In which case I'd go ahead and select this blob vector, and then this time we could look at applying a flat shape to that, and then we could go ahead and press apply and see the result of that there in the 3D view. And then once you're happy, you can then close out. And you can see we've got the 3 components listed within our component tree. We can see the 3 component grayscales in the 2D view, and we can see the 3 components that we have in the 3D view. And we can now look at individually editing each one of these if we wanted to. So I can go and select the circle, hold down Shift, we'll also select the grayscale for the rectangle, and we'll select the grayscale for the blob shape, again still holding down Shift. With them all selected, I can right click and then use the option to delete them. You'll see they've been deleted from the 2D view, from the 3D view, and they're no longer visible here in our component tree. So now we're going to show you how the different choices you make within the form will react with different vector outlines. So this time we're going to look at creating the same shape amongst the different individual vectors. So we're just going to box select all of these vectors so that they're all highlighted there, and then we'll go over to the create shape form. Okay, so we're going to look at creating one shape over 5 individual parts. Now, this isn't normally the way that you'd work. All we're doing here is just demonstrating the different shapes and the different choices that we can make within the form on different shaped vectors. So to start with, we're going to look at the curved profile. We're going to look at the effects that we have when we adjust the angle. So let's just start by putting in the 45-degree angle, and I'll just go ahead and press apply so you can see the result of that in the 3D view. If we just put that in the ISO view, we can see that it's created a shape based on the curved profile at an angle of 45 degrees between each one of these vector outlines. If I knew the angle that I wanted to use, I can simply type a value in here. So for example, we'll type in 60, press apply, and you'll see that the software will update the result of what we've got here in our form against the vectors that we're using to create this shape. Now, if I didn't know the angle that I wanted to use, I could just look at using the slider. For example, I could increase that, and whenever I let go of the slider, the software will instantly update, showing me the result of the settings in our form in the 3D view. Okay, we can drop that slider down just to decrease the angle. We could also go into negative values whereby it's creating a shape that is now subtracting from the modeling plane. So let's just take that back up to around 23. So now let's have a look at the effect the angled profile has on these shapes. So if we select the angled profile, you'll see that the software will automatically update the settings for each one of these shapes, and we can see the result of that here in the 3D view. Again, if we wanted to be precise, we could type in an angle followed by the space bar, and the space bar will apply the settings and update the look of that in the 3D view. And again, we could look at using the slider to increase the angle. We could look at that, the y-axis, just to see how high these shapes are looking, and just put that on a slight tilt there. It's also worth noting that the higher you get, more angle that you have, the more height that you have. But when you get to 90, if we go to 90, what happens is it actually defaults back to 45 degrees, as 90 degrees will naturally exist in this case, not possible, as we'd have a vertical edge. So now let's have a look at the effects of the flat profile. So if I select the flat option in there, you'll notice that the angle selection options are now all greyed out, and that's because it has no effect on the profile as we're using the flat option to create flat shapes. Now, a way that we give it height is by applying a base height in here, and you can input values and that will create the height for the flat shape that you want to create. For example, we could look at giving that a base height of 1/4 inch, then press space to accept that, and you'll see that that will assign this shape a height of 1/4 inch and the shape remains flat. Not only can I type in a base height, I could look at using the slider, and again you'll see in the 3D view it's automatically updated that, so when I hover my cursor over this circle here, you'll see in the bottom right hand corner we're presented with a Z value of 0.315, which matches that in our entry form for the base height here. And so having the option to create a base height doesn't just solely apply to flat shapes. You can use it in conjunction with the other profiled shapes. So for example, if we just click on this line here, that will just take our base height to 0. Then what we could do is we could look at applying a curved profile, and here we'll just type in a value of 40 degrees and then press space to accept that, and we can see the result of those shapes using those settings within these vectors and what we've got here in the 3D view. So as I said, we can look at applying a base height on top of the profile heights. So here we could just simply enter in a base height. Let's go with 1/8 inch, press space to accept that, and you can see the result of that. We've got the 1/8 inch height of the base, and then on top we've got that curved profile of 40 degrees as we do so in the form. Right, so let's change this. So we're going to go with an angle of 60 degrees, a base height, we're going to have that at 0. Look at that down the Z-axis. We could go ahead and press apply. So let's look at each one of these shapes. Now, the height that the shape reaches is all based on the width of the vector that you're using to create the shape. And so when we're using the Create Shape tool, all we're doing is creating a profile with an angle, and we're just stretching that about the width of the vector that you've got selected. So let's take a look at this circle. So you can see here we have quite a big width there, and all we're doing is taking that profile with the angle and we're stretching that across, and that's creating quite a lot of height there. If we just put that in the ISO view, and then we'll just zoom in. Okay, so we've got quite a lot of height there. Now, if we were to look at a shape that is quite narrow, for example, if we take the bottom of this egg shape here, we have less space to stretch across. And so the height that we're going to get in this area is actually going to be significantly less. And so as a general rule of thumb, the more width that you have, the higher the shape, and the narrower the vector, you'd see the result would show to have less height. So let's take a look at this blob shape here. Okay, so with a final height set to no limit, what the software's doing is it's scaling the height in proportion to the width of the vector. Okay, so here we have quite a large width, then it narrows in the center, and then we have quite a large width again. And so when I run my cursor over this area here, we can see we're showing a height of around 0.3, and then as we get to the narrow part of our component, we'll see that the Z height is displaying as just under 0.2. Then we get back to the wider area, it's going back up to 0.32 again. And so the software scales the height in proportion to the width of the vectors. Now there are other options available to us in order to control the height of the shape. For example, we could look at this section here. Let's take a look at the limit to height option. So if we click on that option there, and so what this does, it uses the shape profile along with the angle, and it will create a shape. Now the moment that it reaches the height that we've got set in the form, for example we've got 0.4 in there, the software is going to flatten that shape off at that height. So you can see at the bottom there my Z value is displaying as 0.4. So let's change the height here. We're going to type in 0.05. We'll press space to accept that. Okay, so what the software has done is taken that curved profile at that 60-degree angle and it's created a shape, but as soon as it's reached the 0.05 height, it's flattened that shape off in all of these vectors, and we can see the result of those settings here in the 3D view. So let's look at increasing the heights that we're going to limit the height of our component to. So I'm just using the scroller, and you can see that with every change I make there, we're getting instant feedback here in the 3D view as to the results of what we're seeing here based on the settings we've got in the form. And so one thing to point out here is that the T actually isn't being flattened off, and if I run my cursor over the T, you can see that the Z height is displaying somewhere around 0.18. Now the reason for this is that this T doesn't actually get up to the value of the 0.315, and so the result of this is a standard profile and angle as if we had set this to a no limit. Now all of the other shapes are being flattened off, so if I put my mouse here you can see the Z shown as 0.315, you can see it the rectangle there as well, 0.315, top of this shape 0.315, and the top of this egg shape here again 0.315, and that's because we've got that entered into our form, so as the shape reaches that value it's flattening off. And so you can continue to alter the heights that we limit our shapes to using the slider. And we can actually limit that to a value that's actually larger than any of the shapes that we have defined. And we'll see that none of them have been affected by the limit to height because none of them are actually reaching that height for that component to limit itself to. Now this really is a nice way to control the height of our shapes, but it does affect our profile by adding that flat area on top of each of our objects. Now another option we have in the form is to scale to an exact height, and this enables us to scale to an exact height, and the highest point of the object will be at the height that we specify within this form. For example, let's use scale to an exact height, and then we're going to put in a height of 1/2 inch. We'll press space to accept that. And so the highest point of this object will be at the peak of this dome, and that's because we already know it has the widest area. Then everything else is just going to scale out in proportion to the width of its own vector. Now when we create shapes, we normally work with one vector at a time. So let's have a look at doing that. Okay, so let's just come over here and we're going to use the reset option. So it's going to clear everything in the 3D view. It's also going to clear the previews in the 2D view. If we click in the white space to deselect all of the vectors, and then we can look at selecting one vector at a time. So with this vector selected, we'll go with the settings we've got here. So curved profile with an angle of 60 degrees, where we're going to scale that to an exact height of 1/2 inch. We'll simply go in there and press apply. And so we can see the result of that there in the 3D view. Then we can use this option here to start a new component. So here we'll select the rectangle vector, then we'll come over. This time we'll look at applying an angled profile. We'll go with an angle of 40 degrees in there. Actually, we'll make that 60, and then what we can do is we can work our way down. We can scale this to an exact height, so let's make that 1/4 inch, and then we could go ahead and press apply and see the result of that. And as I run my cursor along the highest points there, you can see in the bottom right hand corner it's displaying as 1/4 inch, and so it's scaling the highest point of this component to the 1/4 inch that I set it to in the form. Okay, so we could go ahead and start another component. So with that selected, let's go over to the blob shape over here. Here we go with a round profile, an angle of 40 degrees, and then we can scale this to an exact height of 3/4 of an inch this time. Then we can press apply and see the result of that. And so the highest point, which is at this peak here, we can see at the bottom right hand corner, the software's telling me that is 3/4 of an inch there. Moving on, we could go ahead and select this egg shape over here. Okay, so now that I've selected this vector, you'll notice that the blob shape has disappeared from the 3D view, and I can no longer see the preview of that there in the 2D view. And the reason that's happened is because I didn't use this option here to start a new component. So let's select back on the blob vector here. The really nice thing about the software is that it remembers the settings that you last used per vector. And so I can see the settings here, so I could go ahead, press apply, and then use this option here to start a new component, where I'd then go ahead and select this egg shape. So this time we'll look at applying an angled profile. We'll go with an angle of 30 degrees in this case. This time I'm also going to look at applying a base height. So we'll go in there and go with a 1/4 inch base height, and I'm also going to scale this to a height of 1/4 of an inch. And then when I go ahead and press apply, we can see the result of those settings here in the 3D view. So you can see that I have the base height there of 1/4 of an inch, and then what it's doing afterwards, it's creating a shape on top where it's scaling that to 1/4 of an inch. So I have a combined height of 1/2 an inch. So it's taking that scaled height 1/4 inch there, and it's adding that on top of the base height to give me the total 1/2 inch height that we're seeing there in that egg shape. So now let's go ahead and we'll start a new component. So now we're going to look at the T shape here, and I want to create quite a flat chamfered edge T. So with that vector selected, let's come over. We're going to look at using an angled profile. So we're going to go with an angle of 45 degrees just to create that chamfered edge. We're also going to look at applying a base height. So we're going to add in a base height of 0.1. So we're going to give that some vertical height. And then we're also going to look at limiting the height of the final shape to 0.1 also. So we'll put in 0.1 in there. And then we could go ahead and press apply. And if we just zoom in, we can take a look at the effect of the T there. So you can see the vertical height coming in at 0.1 of an inch. We've got this 45-degree angle surrounding our shape where it's being flattened off at 0.1, and we have a total combined height value of 0.2, which is the base height with the final height on top of that. Right then, so let's just put that back in the ISO view, and then we can close out of the create shape form. So here we can see our components listed in our component tree. I can select them from the tree, and you'll see that it will highlight in both the 2D and the 3D view. I can select the components from the 2D view. I can also look at selecting components from the 3D view. And if I wanted to now, I could make further edits to these shapes using many of the model editing tools that we've got available. So let's take component 5, hold down shift, and we're going to select component 1 so they're all selected. We're going to right click and we're going to use the option here to delete them. So now we're going to look at a final option that we didn't look at in the create shape form. So I'm going to start by taking the circle, and I'm just going to move that over so it's overlapping the rectangle. I'm just going to put this in the Z view, and then we're going to select the rectangle, and we're going to go into the create shape form. So let's go ahead and give that a curved profile. We'll go with an angle of 30 degrees. We're going to set the final height of that to no limit. I'm just going to go ahead and press apply. Okay, then we're going to go and start a new component. So this time I'm going to select the circle. Again, we're going to go with a curved profile. This time I'm going to go with 30 degrees. Again, no limit here, and then we could go ahead and press apply. And we can see that where the circle overlaps the rectangle, it's actually adding on top of that rectangle there. And we know so because we can see it here in the 3D view. And we can also see that our combine mode is set to add. So what we could do is we could look at setting the combine mode of this to merge, and then look at a way that we could make it look as though the circle is sat proud in front of the rectangle. And so we have the option to do so by looking at the tilt option. Now in a number of cases you want to have a component in front of another. In this case we want the circle in front of the rectangle. And so we can look at applying a tilt to the circle. Now a tilt is basically like an angled plane or an angled base height, and so we can control the areas that we want to raise rather than raising the whole shape. So to create the tilt, we simply use the check tilt option, and then we use the set option here. So this has got an anchor next to this, and so here we have to specify our anchor point, which we want that to be on the left hand side. So really we're just setting the pivot point here. So we're going to go on the left hand side of our circle, and you'll see now that I'm presented with this dotted line that's anchored in place according to where I clicked for the anchor point. And now we can choose the direction of the tilt, in which case we want to go from left to right. So I can click on the right side of the circle, and the software will automatically apply a 10-degree tilt to that component. And if we take a look in the 3D view, you can see the effect of that there. Okay, so we've got our anchor point over on the left hand side. We've applied a tilt from left to right, and so it's created that angled base height based on the angle that we've got here, which is 10 degrees. Now we want that circle just coming over the rectangle, so all of this height is quite unnecessary in this case. So what we could do is we could look at reducing that angle. So let's try 5, and then we'll press space to enter that in. Okay, so you can still see we still have quite a bit of height there, so we'll just look at halving that. Let's try 2.5, space to enter that in, and you can see we've got minimal height there, so that's just enough to make it look as though the circle is stood proud of the rectangle. So now we can close out of the form. We can see the two components in the component tree. We can also see their combine modes as we set them when we created the shapes. So now we can take the grayscale for the rectangle component, and we can use the delete key on the keyboard to delete it. We'll take the circle, and then we're just going to move that out. So it's important to note that your components have no relation to the vectors that they were originally made from. So with that dragged out, you can see that the vector stays in the same place, and the only time that there is a connection is when we actually set the shape up in the create shape form. After that, there is no connection between the shape and the vector itself. There is one thing that the vector will remember, and that's the parameters that were previously used for the vector in the create shape form. For example, let's just delete this component here. We'll select this vector, we'll go back into the create shape form, and you'll see that it's picked up that we last used a curved profile with an angle of 30 degrees where we applied a tilt at 2.5 degrees. If I select the rectangle, again, round profile 30 degrees, the blob shape, round profile 40 degrees where we're scaling that to 3/4 of an inch, and so on. And you'll see that with each click of the vector, the form is updating to the last settings that we used for that vector in the create shape form. And this also works if you copied a shape from one session of Aspire to another. And so that completes this tutorial on how to create shapes using the create shape tool.